and Fred, Jonathan and Fred are respectively, Jonathan is the corporate law director at Harris Bricken, and Fred, the director of international law, also at Harris Bricken. Harris Bricken is law-based, Seattle-based firm which specializes in corporate and many other branches of law, but particularly in cannabis law and U.S. cannabis industry and U.S. cannabis law. Fred and Jonathan, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for taking the time to share with us some of your knowledge.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you.
Well, there we go. We want to ask you some questions in regards to this industry, and we'll get to the matter in hand. And you also told us beforehand that you're willing to take questions from the public. So, if you have any questions, write them down in the chat box, and we'll be presenting them to both Jonathan and Fred, respectively. And well, you can choose who wants to answer each. And well, without further ado, let's get into it.
Let's go ahead. This talk to you is brought to you by Harris Bricken. So,
Jonathan and Fred, how does U.S. companies can take advantage of Mexico's cannabis legalization, concretely in the corporate area?
Fred, do you want to start by laying the groundwork, I think, for kind of the bigger picture for U.S. companies who are looking to go to Mexico?
Sure, absolutely. So, as most of the participants in this summit probably know, there are great strides being made here in the United States in terms of cannabis legalization. As one of my colleagues put it recently during an event, we are now at the point where it makes more sense to list those states that do not have some kind of legalization as opposed to those that have. We are getting to that point where the majority of states have at least legalized medical cannabis, and we have a growing number of states that are also legalizing recreational cannabis. Some big states as well. Some of the most recent news involve the state of New York. If I remember correctly, I think New York is the fourth most populous state in the country. So that means that out of the top four states in terms of population, two have legalized both, or will soon have legalized both medical and recreational cannabis. In addition to what's happening in the United States, I think it's important to take a step back and look at what's happening at a global level. And if you look at that, you find that really North America, our general North American region, is really at the epicenter of the legalization wave taking place in the US. I think when there are misconceptions regarding what's happening in Europe, I think that a lot of people assume that Europe is very liberal when it comes to the issue of cannabis. But in reality, when you look at the law, not so much at perhaps the law enforcement practice, but if you look at the actual laws, it's actually for the most part it's still a rather restrictive environment. So when you're looking at the countries that are making the biggest advances, they are disproportionately represented in North America. Canada, of course, has legalized recreational cannabis. Many states here in the United States have done so, and of course there is what's happening in Mexico. So if you look elsewhere around the world, you are not going to find a region where there is as much happening when it comes to cannabis. We are still at a point where the full potential of the legalization trend is not available to companies. I think we're going to have to wait a while before all of the opportunities become available. But looking at these trends, I think U.S. companies are going to find themselves enjoying a wealth of opportunities not only within the country, but also at the regional level. And even though, again, there are still issues that have to be sorted out, the US-Mexico border still remains an important obstacle when it comes to the cannabis industry. I think looking ahead at the medium term, we could potentially see very exciting opportunities taking shape for US cannabis companies.
So Fred, I think you raised a really great point. And I'll just say this, and then you guys can jump in if you want follow-up questions as well, because Fred has a wealth of knowledge, and I always love to hear his take on, especially from a global perspective. But if you know, we take where the U.S., what has happened in the U.S., right? We had early legalization in California, in Washington, in Oregon, and then now we have other states following, like New York. We have a lot of multi-state operators who come to us and say, I want to go to this new market. What can I do? And that's really the right question, right? Because it's the same thing that applies to Mexico. When you are looking at a new market and all of a sudden, all you're hearing in the news is, it's legal, right? It's legal, the market's open, let's go. I mean, that's everyone gets very excited at that point. They call the lawyers, and the lawyers talk them, through all the processes and say, well, we are at step one, and we need to understand exactly how you can dip your toes in. So if those of you who are listening, who are already operating in multiple states, who have been thinking about operating in more than one US state, that is the right way to approach the Mexican market, because it has a solid legal system. We have, of course, proximity and geography. So for a lot of states in the US, it is as easy to go into the Mexican market from a distance perspective, right, as it is to go from say a Texas to a Washington operation, right? So it's very helpful to think in those terms. Geographically, proximity matters. And of course, I'm going to discuss some of the other kind of bigger issues when, if I have a US company come to me and say, I want to go into Mexico, what should I know right now? That's what I'm going to try and hit on for the next 10 minutes or so, is to really give you a feel for, if you were coming to our office and asking that question, how I would help you approach the topic of going from, in an industry where you are familiar, but into a new legal system in a new country. And I'll pause and see if, Olive, did you have a question you wanted to ask Fred or me as we move forward?
Yes, Jonathan, actually, it has to do precisely with the corporate laws that, in Mexico, we have one big corporate law, and it's a federal law, so pretty much it's the same in every state, but you have 50 laws and 50 states that regulate it separately, and not all of, as you said, not all states have legalized cannabis in the US. Let me ask you this: what if an American partner wants to come to Mexico, for example, to incorporate and partner with a Mexican partner? Is there any special kind of authorization or permission that he has to get before he partners up with a Mexican partner, if they both want to set up a cannabis company? Is there something that he cannot do, or only on the state that's legalized? Is there anything like that? Because as you may anticipate, not only are American citizens eager to get into Mexican cannabis industry, but also Mexicans, we are excited to have what we call foreign investment from the US. What would a Mexican need to know in these regards before he partners with a US partner?
Yeah, great question. So I'll talk about it from the US side coming to Mexico, and from Mexican companies looking to accept business partners from the US. So from the US perspective, those state laws and even the federal law that prohibits our kind of the widespread cannabis activities in the US, those laws, if I want to go to Mexico and I want to invest there, there's no prohibition, right? My state in the US cannot restrict me from those activities, and the federal government can't restrict me either to a point, right? I mean, there are still, you think this is really a criminal law question, right? Am I doing anything that would subject me to criminal activity? And that is largely going to be coming from the US federal government. And so as long as I am not trying to traffic drugs, I'm not trying to launder money, you know, if I'm trying to be I say kind of for shorthand, an upstanding business person, then from the US side, there are no complications with me wanting to take my capital or my equipment or my seeds or my expertise to Mexico in order to engage in business there. Now, on the Mexican side, if you're a Mexican company looking at accepting investors from the US or business partners, because that's generally how we're looking at it, right? Either you want capital and you need capital, or you want expertise. And sometimes you get those both together. That's the best of both worlds, is if you find the right strategic partner who is coming from the United States, who has expertise, and we have a broad expertise. I would say not everyone. I mean, there's still a lot of idiots in the industry, right? There's still a lot of people who just don't know what they're doing. They kind of mean well, but if you're a successful business person, you need to vet those people, right? I mean, anybody who says, I'm coming from the US, I come from the state of Washington. I've had a license for 6 years. That could mean nothing, right? Because in the state of Washington, they issued licenses, and there are still a lot of people who are sitting on their licenses and have zero operations, right? So that's part of your greater due diligence process. And Fred and I will talk about that a little bit when we're talking about, as a US company, how do you prepare to go abroad? Because a lot of companies think they're ready to go abroad when they're probably not quite ready. But so back to the question of a Mexican company or a Mexican investor taking money and expertise, that is part one. Just because someone is coming from the US and they tell you that they have expertise, it doesn't mean that that's reality. And so you'll want to do your diligence. You'll want to find out who they are and have them come down, have them demonstrate for you what they're good at, right? If they're good at, get references from other people they've worked with. This is sound business practices. And just because someone says they have expertise in a cannabis area doesn't mean they're the right partner for you.
Fred, John, I would like to ask you something. It's very well known that right now in the US it's fairly forbidden certain things, right? But when you think about investments in our country related with cannabis, what is going to apply? There's any kind of certain, I don't know, prohibition on that, or you have to take care about something if you want to do some investments in countries like Mexico if you are an American citizen?
For example, you talked about the criminal charges that might apply, and we, as foreigners, we've heard about, for example, the RICO Act and all this. I mean, does that would that be an obstacle for a U.S. citizen to partner with a Mexican citizen?
Yeah, because you have trouble, I think, in taxes. It's really hard to make deductible some expenses if you are related with cannabis industry. So that's why I'm asking this question, but you may know better. So
I think Fred would be a great person to answer that question, because he and I have kicked this idea around quite a bit about the difference with really all of this is really tied up in immigration questions, right? And so I'm going to kick that over to Fred because he really has a better grasp on it than I do.
Sure. So you bring up an excellent point, and I think this really ties into much of what we are talking about during this session. If you're looking at going back to what Jonathan was talking about, right? If you're a cannabis business in the United States, you're looking for expansion opportunities, you have to be careful. You have to be careful, especially when you are entering overseas markets. Even if you're going to a different state within the country, you have to be careful. There are some precautions that you have to take. You have to do your due diligence, but that is even more so when you're dealing with foreign markets. And there are a number of ways in which you could encounter, or cannabis companies could encounter, could be subject to legal exposure. Let's just take one example, the issue of immigration. So let's say, for example, that Jonathan and I run a successful cannabis business in the state of Washington. We're actually doing something with our license. We're operating, let's say, retail stores, or perhaps we have production facilities, and we say we really want to expand internationally. There's great opportunities in Canada. There's great opportunities in Mexico. Let's do this. Let's focus on that as our next big thing. And we sit down and we decide, who are we going to put in charge of this operation, right? Who from within our management team is going to go down and take care of these operations, or do we need to bring someone new, maybe someone with a little bit more experience in these markets? Well, as I mentioned in the beginning, the border when it comes to cannabis is still a reality, and this is not strictly a U.S.-Mexico consideration. It's the same thing with the U.S. and Canada. This surprises people sometimes, but what might be legal on both sides of the border might not be legal across the border, right? You can go down to Seattle if you're a Canadian and purchase cannabis in our retail stores there. You could do the same thing once you get back home to Vancouver, but you have to be very careful about what you do when you're crossing the border. And the same logic really applies to business operations. The U.S. government, more specifically the agencies tasked with immigration and border control, have taken very hard lines when it comes to cannabis. They have shown, I think it is fair to say, no deference to what's happening at the state level. They have opted, in fact, to take a somewhat confrontational attitude in the face of the developments in states like Washington, states like California, which of course are border states. So it is well known. There are many anecdotes regarding this. People can get into a lot of trouble when they are crossing the border. One of the things that happens is that, for example, executives at cannabis companies might not be allowed to enter the United States. This is an issue not only for a foreign national who lives abroad. It can also be an issue for a foreign national who lives in the United States. So, for example, going back to our hypothetical, let's say that Jonathan and I decide that we want to bring our friend who is very successful. Let's say he's just let's just say our friend from Korea who is working at Amazon. He's doing really well, excellent marketing skills. We think he could be a real asset to our operation. Well, guess what? That person, even though he has a green card, might not be allowed to come back into the United States if he takes up employment with our cannabis company, and especially, of course, if we are sending that person to go to Mexico or Canada to engage in cannabis business activities. Even worse than this, naturalized citizens can be at risk. This is a glitch, perhaps, in our nationality laws, but in the United States, if you are not a natural-born citizen, if you acquired your nationality through a naturalization process, you carry that with you for the rest of your life. Essentially, there are circumstances that can lead to your loss of nationality. And I know for a fact that there are lawyers who will not advise cannabis clients because they are U.S. citizens who became U.S. citizens through naturalization. So there are very serious risks. So these are the sort of things that companies have to think about in the context of cross-border activity. What might be okay if you're running a purely domestic operation might not be okay the moment you start crossing the border. And again, the same thing applies to the U.S. citizens and the U.S. companies that are engaging in this business. Let's say you have a particular business model, right? You're counting on certain tax exemptions. You're counting on certain ways of organizing your business. That might not be possible at the moment in the context of cannabis, right? So there are adjustments that might have to be made at this stage to make sure that you are fully compliant with the laws, and in some cases you're not going to be as able to protect and organize your business in the way that you would like. I'll give you one more example, and with this I'll turn it back to you. Take the issue of intellectual property. A part of any successful business model, any successful business plan, is the protection of your intellectual property, right? You especially for purposes of our conversation today, let's focus on trademarks. Well, registration of trademarks in the United States that have a connection to cannabis, and in fact in other countries as well, right? I mean, we've written about this in our blog in places like Mexico and places like Brazil. There are still issues. It's not the connection to cannabis can make registration more difficult or even impossible, right? So these are adjustments that businesses are going to have to make, right? They're not going, in some cases, they're not going to enjoy the same protections and the same, if you will, security, the same confidence that they might with other products and services.
Thank you. That was a
Fred,
great.
you raised a couple of great.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Go ahead. I just wanted to add on to what you had said, Fred. You raised a couple of great points. The first one is about intellectual property, and I think we can talk a little bit more about that either now or later. And I just wanted to say the intellectual property is between intellectual property and employees, right? I mean, those are two extremely foundational parts of any business plan, because when you're going into a new market, you need to know at the outset, is the country I'm going into with regards to trademark, which is often kind of the trade dress. It's how owners think about their company, right? That's the face of their company. Is a country a first to file trademark state, or is it a first to use trademark state? And so for Mexico, it's a first to file state. And so if you are looking at how do I lay the groundwork for my Mexico business plan, I'd say you want to start with finding the right people. That's why we talk about employees, and I'll mention a little bit more about that in a minute. But the other massive part is make sure that you start now with getting your English registrations done in Mexico and getting those English registrations translated into something that makes sense for the Mexican market, right? You have up to 3 years after you file in order to actually use that mark. And so if it could take that long for Mexico to really get online, right, with the federal legislation being implemented down to the state levels, it could take that long. And certainly as now everyone's looking and they're thinking, well, what kind of brand should I use? What are the good brands in the US? This happens, of course, in China quite a bit. You want to make sure that your IP, even if you don't have a concrete plan to go in yet, that you can start with your IP. That's very low-hanging fruit, and you should have that at the top of your list. The second step that I think is extremely important is what Fred talked about, which is when you're starting to have discussions with the people you really care about, right? You start to have those plans. You have friends in Mexico. You have business associates. You want to start setting up business meetings. If you're in the U.S., you need to go to Mexico, right? You don't want to put your potential business partners and your employees at risk by having them come to the U.S. as Fred discussed, on cannabis business, right? It's not a good idea, and so you need to get to Mexico to have those discussions, and that way you can, you can see the market, right? I think face-to-face meetings, as long as we're all able to do those, that is the ideal. But adding the potential immigration issues on top of that, you don't want anyone in your organization in the future to be barred from entering the U.S. because they came to the U.S. on cannabis business. So it is a big, as Fred said, a big glitch in the system. But until the U.S. federal laws change regarding cannabis, we have to abide by federal laws regarding immigration, and we need to be extremely careful.
In this particular matter, Jonathan, Guillermo Wolfat is asking us, is there any special law on intellectual property for cannabis inventions? Guillermo, are you asking for Mexico or for the US? If you can clear that out. But it is actually very interesting, Jonathan, if you could tell us, is there any particular...
I can answer
about
Mexico, and Mexico is not. So yeah.
Is there both? Yeah, I believe that it would be great, Jonathan, to know, will there be, or is there any I don't know, classification or something like that in intellectual property in the US?
Sure, I can talk to that a little bit, and Fred can fill in some of my gaps. So at this point, if you're familiar with the US system, we have the 50-state system, and each state has its own IP registry, right, with regard to trademarks and trade names, right? Patents are done at the federal level with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. We call that the USPTO. And then you do your national trademark registrations with the USPTO as well. So the way that we have had to structure this within the US for our clients is to, for specific cannabis activities, those, like let's say you have a brand that's specifically associated with that you package on your cannabis product, that cannot be trademarked at the USPTO. It can be trademarked at the state levels. And so what you'll see, if you're a Mexican company looking at a US company and trying to evaluate the assets that they're bringing, say you're going to do a business combination, some kind of merger or some kind of joint venture where the US company is going to bring its assets, its knowledge, including its registered intellectual property, and wants to translate that over to Mexico. And the Mexican company is looking at it and thinking, well, what is this worth, right? What is the value? Because if you don't have a federal registration, is a state registration as good as a federal registration? The answer is no. But for cannabis specific assets, that's the best they can do right now, right? So if we have a multi-state, let's say we have a company in the United States that has operations all along the West Coast, Washington, Oregon, California, they will have 3 separate sets of registrations, right, for their intellectual property. They will have registrations in Washington, in Oregon, and in California. They will also have their IP attorney, will probably have already prepared the applications to be ready that when cannabis is legalized federally in the United States, that they can take those state registrations and push them through to the USPTO. So that is part one, to kind of understand how within the United States we deal with those registrations. Now, patents are a different scenario, right? Because you can patent, and I'm not a patent attorney, Fred's not a patent attorney. This is what we picked up along the way. Patents are a different scenario because patents can be used for a number of uses, right? So sorry, Philip just asked. Philip, I'm referring to trademarks, right? Copyrights, to the extent that they can be copyrighted at the state level, which isn't very often. I'm generally talking about trademarks, state trademarks. Okay, so anything that you affix to your website, to any goods you sell, including T-shirts, hats, all of that stuff. So when we're looking at the, yes, go ahead.
No, finish, please. Finish, and then after I have a question for you.
Okay, sure. And so Fred, do you want to fill in any of my gaps? You do more USPTO work than I do. And like I said, neither of us are patent attorneys, but I think you have a little more depth than I do on how the patents are reviewed if they're specific to cannabis related activities.
Well, I want to mention a couple of things, not necessarily filling gaps. I think you've provided a really good overview of what the situation is regarding trademarks. But just one thing to keep in mind, the good news is that you're not getting your trademarks registered, but no one else is, right? So this is also important to keep in mind. However, this does present an opportunity for savvy companies to take advantage of the situation. If you look at it very superficially, you might say, well, nobody else is going to be registering my trademark. So let's not worry about this. We're just going to wait until the law changes, and then we'll worry about this. But there are other things you can do, right? I mean, you can look at let's call them peripheral products, for lack of a better word, right? You can start getting T-shirts out there with your logo, right? You can start doing other things. You can start looking for other products that, I mean, you can start trademarking other products that are not goods or services that are not cannabis itself, and start building that protection around your brand. This is, these issues are not necessarily, these issues are not new to cannabis, right? Or are not, sorry, what I mean to say is these issues are not unique to cannabis, right? There have been throughout, for a long time, companies have had to struggle with these issues, right? They're not able to register a mark because of similarity. They're not able to register a mark because it is contrary to the laws of a particular country for X or Y reason. So this is where a good IP attorney will help you come up with a suitable strategy, right? You cannot get your trademark registered. Well, then maybe you need to look at registering some copyright. You cannot get a trademark registered for your logo that you've been using in your home country, well, maybe you need to start looking for a different logo for that particular market. Maybe you need to think, Jonathan and I do a lot of work in China, for example. Well, then you maybe need to think of a different Chinese name than the one that you had thought of, right? Because that one, you're not going to be able to register it. Maybe you need to start changing your branding. Regarding patents, as Jonathan said, I'm not a patent attorney, and I have my best friend is a patent attorney, so I have a lot of respect for what they do and for the complexities of what they do. However, what I do know about patents, right, is that there are different schools of thought regarding the morality of products, if you will, and my general understanding, it's not something that I deal with professionally. It's more of an academic general interest. Is that it's just really going to depend on the product and what it does.
Yeah, I would like to change a little bit the conversation because we have here a lot of interest on doing investments, but also this is spicy and I'm sorry, but it has to be put in the table. There is fear because there is not enough stuff sometimes about Mexico. And I cannot be more clear than that because we know that it's a different legislation, it's a different country. And sometimes related to that, what will be your advice in a new layer of protections, or if I want to invest, but I don't want to put my information there, or I want to do it through a third company or a shadow investor, what will be your advice on that? Because we know there's a lot of people really interested in do that, but fear is something that exists. And we think that could be something that could, I don't know,
let's think of this process as a process where the investment starts in your country. And would there be some kind of an additional protective shield or layer, corporate layer for an investor before he comes to Mexico?
Yeah, that provides more certainty and more to feel free, to feel safe, that your data, your information, everything is safe and nobody is taking that information in, I don't know.
Fred, do you want to talk for a minute about the international due diligence work that we've done in the past? And Fred, I have Fred start because he loves to ferret out fraud, right? He loves to find the fraud or potential fraud, right? I mean, it's Fred loves to do that. So Fred, if you can share a little bit, maybe a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of your MO when you're looking at a new company on behalf of an investor, right? Fred and I have done this for a lot of companies, both with inbound US investment, outbound US investment to a number of markets. And so Fred, I'll let Fred talk kind of about his due diligence because Fred has a great brain for that. And then I'll talk kind of generally about how you put a deal together to get you to the point where you're certain that, once you found someone you like, how do you also get into a contractual relationship with them to the point where you feel comfortable sending them a few $100,000 or a few $1 million? I mean, it is a different level of comfort. So maybe Fred, if you wouldn't mind starting with that would be a great foundation, I think.
Sure, absolutely. Many years ago, I used to work in the corporate services, financial services sector. And part of what we did was offshore company formation. And a conversation that I had very often with clients involved this issue of confidentiality. And often I would have clients from countries in Latin America tell me, look, there is this perception that we are forming these structures in offshore jurisdictions to evade taxes, et cetera. But these clients would tell me, look, you have to understand this is a matter of security for us, right? We don't want people in our home countries to know how much money we have because that can make us targets of all sorts, right? There's political pressures, there's criminal pressures. So along those, departing from that point, there is ultimately a lot of this comes down to how much you're willing to spend on your structuring, right? If you want to, here in the United States, in most states, you can set up a company for $100 or maybe even less in some states. Opening a company is not complicated, right? However, if issues like confidentiality, if issues like the non-disclosure of certain corporate information is important to you, then there are tools available, but that means you're going to have to put more into your corporate structure than simply opening an LLC in Florida or Washington or wherever. I think there's also two tracks that are important to consider here. On the one hand, there is what we could consider the statutory transparency, right? You're doing business, and as Jonathan was saying, this is something with which we help clients, right? Clients will come to us and say, hey, we want to purchase these goods from this company. Can you help us investigate this company? And there are situations where we say, look, they are registered in the British Virgin Islands or another offshore jurisdiction. There is very little information that we can obtain, right? So in that sense, that particular company achieved its purpose of withholding certain information from the public. However, when you're doing business, right? When you're doing business, that is not the end of the story, right? You have to deal with potential partners who are not going to be content with a certificate of incorporation that says, well, we're owned by a company based in the British Virgin Islands, and that's it, right? They're going to say, okay, great, but we want to know more. Your banks are also going to want to know more, right? Regulators are going to want to know more. So I think that if we take this broad view, then we can perhaps companies can begin to craft a strategy where they limit the exposure that to the general public of their confidential information, and prevent bad actors from accessing certain information. However, as a practical matter, there is probably going to have to be more disclosure to regulators, to banks, to business partners. So there's a balance to be struck there. I think as long as companies understand that, as long as companies or individuals who are getting involved in the business understand that these are two separate tracks, then I think that there are strategies that can be followed. But I guess going back to what Jonathan said, and to sort of come full circle here, you just have to be realistic, right? If you are only providing very basic information to potential partners, even to potential customers about who you are, then that is going to make it difficult to establish trust in your business and in your offerings, right? So there's that balance to be struck. I think in terms of perhaps protecting information regarding who the investors are, that's more doable, protecting that information from public disclosure. But in terms of being honest and open with government authorities, banking institutions, investors, then I think businesses just have to accept that there's going to have to be some degree of openness and transparency.
And Fred, I think it's at some point that the real question is, when are you ready to let go of your funds? So for a company that's looking to invest in Mexico, you have to remember that we're dealing with a developing country. Okay, I mean that's part one, and a developing country means that things are in flux. Okay, not that things are necessarily bad or that people are inherently out to get you and take your money, right? Because that happens just as much in the United States as it does anywhere else, right? We have a lot of fraud in the United States. We have a lot of securities fraud, and people, investors lose their money a lot. So just because you have a background in cannabis, you have a pool to invest in Mexico, that doesn't mean that you will automatically win in Mexico. Okay, so it doesn't mean that you're going to discard your solid investment principles of doing your research, of knowing your business partners, and of protecting yourself through contracts. Now, Mexico, I just looked this up because I was curious. Mexico ranks 43 worldwide in enforcing contracts and 33rd in resolving insolvency. So there's some very good indicators, right? I mean, so I think that if you're looking at comparing Mexico to other developing nations, you will be pleasantly surprised, right? If you haven't done business in Mexico, you know, the idea that your contracts can be enforced, that the legal system works, that investors from abroad are treated the same as domestic investors. Those are all sound principles that you can hang your hat on, right? And so if you're wondering, kind of getting a gut check for, is my money going to be as safe in Mexico, a Mexico cannabis investment as it would be in the United States? I think that you'll find plenty of risky cannabis investments in the United States, and plenty of good opportunities and risky opportunities in Mexico as well. And so it will come down to those due diligence principles and figuring out whether you really trust who you're getting into a business contract with. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is when you're an investor in Mexico, you have what I would consider even better oversight of the business than you would if you were in the U.S. Right? The U.S. we tend to let everyone contract however they want to contract, and so if you're investing in a Mexican company, for instance, you get if you own 25% or more, you have the right to appoint a board member. Right? If you're in a U.S. company, you could own 99%. I have a family company that I've worked with where the parents were transitioning the ownership to the children. The parents kept 1%. They sold the 99% to their children, but the parents kept all of the management rights with that 1% ownership. And so it may seem a little underhanded, but that's allowed by laws in the United States, right? We can contract however we want to. And so even though you may kind of look at the Mexican laws and say, well, this might not be ideal, there are still upsides to those kind of scenarios where where minority investors have better protection than they would get in the United States.
Thanks, guys. Those are great answers, and we have 2 minutes left in the clock. I truly like the questions that we got in the table today, the ones that we had prepared, because they address what as of now can be done in the cannabis industry in Mexico, which is trademark law, corporate law, start building up and incorporating these partnerships. I think we've covered the basics. There was one question up there that we wanted to address. It's regarding Mexican law, and it's do you think that Mexican state laws will be a drawback for investors despite the federal Mexican law being approved? We do not, because cannabis is a federal matter, and structure of corporations is a federal matter too. So state laws will do little damage. We believe will do little damage or no damage at all. So in regards to choosing your location, it has to do with the land.
With what Luis just asked or put in the chat, that's not precisely true. There is not, I mean, not in the medical way. In the medical regulation right now, there is no limitation on that. And related to the law.
And in regards to the law, we still don't have that cleared up because we don't have a law. So there's still no limit as to foreign investment. Okay, Jonathan, Bench, Fred, Rocafort, partners at Harris Bricken, and partners with Logic, Harris Bricken and Logic. Someone asked if you have a lawyer here in Mexico. I'd say you have not only local Harris Bricken's lawyers in Mexico City and in south of our country, south of Mexico, but also you have a brother firm partnership here in Mexico.
Yeah, support.
It was great, guys, to share these moments, camera and mics with you, giants of this industry in the US.
Thank you. Very happy to be with you. Look forward to working with you on cross-border projects. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.